So my assumption is that we would like to go in the order in which panelists are listed. And so if we want to start off, sorry, let me just look. So the first paper is Deconstructing Epistemic Violence, an African Perspective on the Discussion of the Local versus International Peace-Building Approaches. And I would, just to make things easier, if folks don't mind introducing themselves, just noting where they're from, their institution affiliations, that would be helpful, as I don't have everyone's bios in front of me right now. I will work to keep time and remind folks when they're running out of time, because we have the 4 presenters. We'll really try to stick to the 15 minutes. So please proceed.
Right, thank you, Michael. Yeah, my name is Zerihune Kinat, and I'm studying I'm doing my master's in peace and conflict studies at the University of Waterloo here in Canada. So my presentation today is about deconstructing epistemic violence with the local versus international peace-building approaches, with critical peace-building and emancipatory peace-building approach from an African perspective. So I'm in the last term of my study in the master's program, and I'm planning to proceed for the PhD in this field again. So I started this research because, when I am very much acquainted with the discussions of this, the liberal notion of peace-building, as an African, I see some, contradictions, and because of the colonial legacy and what is taking place in Africa and in other parts of the world due to the change of the power structure, change of internal power struggles for democratization, for local forces of ownership of political decision making and participation, with our competing demands and the contestations within the continent and elsewhere globally at the same time, and also the challenges that the liberal international peace building approach is facing because of some failed interventions in Somalia and also lack of consensus in international mechanism to intervene in a very in a human security approach, which could prevent state collapse and also help maintain the social cohesion and fabric of the society and institutions and culture of the society. So, and because of that, the Rwandan case happened, and as you know, other countries, and recently in the Libyan case, the Afghanistan case again. So, and there is always the contradiction and tension between the local and the international. And I'll start my discussion from the 90s, since the 90s was, a historic moment because of the post-Cold War era. As you know, the Cold War ended, and Boutros Ghali, the then Secretary General of the UN, declared, an agenda for peace, which is a different kind of peace building and peacemaking intervention under the UN, which anticipated to also more of the use of the international multilateral organizations and cooperation among different countries and organizations. And this peace building and peacemaking approaches have their own limitations historically, and they have never been free from the liberal Western or Eurocentric power structure and interventionist approach. So this has also resulted in epistemic violence and perpetuation of some the 21st century. And this manifested somehow the Western hegemony in peace scholarship and practice, which is still problematic because of the deeply entrenched, deeply embedded conceptualization of peace, the idea of also knowledge production, what is peace and how to make it peace, and what kind of peace is appropriate to which society or community, and what kind of institutions. These are very much power-centered discussions, which have a notion of, understanding how we define ourselves in the power of meaning. So I will start from that. The promotion of peace was based on liberal ideas of democracy and the market economy, as we know, And the agenda for peace introduced this as an approach for the UN to expand its outreach and promote peace. And as you know, the Somalia, Rwanda, and Bosnia incidents made these catastrophic incidents to make the UN very much concerned, and the international community, especially with the proliferation of civil society organizations which have been working tirelessly in different parts of the world. We see, localization of the peace building approaches being, given much due attention and new perspective. However, this also followed by some criticisms which see this localization by itself has its own inherent problems. So, and in the 90s, some scholars which happen, to come from the liberal schools of the Western Hemisphere, especially, one of the famous person is Paul Liderock, who proposed the idea of the local peace building approach, which is peace from below. The idea is that the locals should be given, the primacy, even though the international organizations, international peace building approaches are still, still in charge of the process and still in charge of with a mandate to make and build peace. But he conceptualized and pioneered the idea of that the local should be at the center of peace building. But at the same time, his notion of local is very much still, arguably different from what an African sees as a local, or which the global South sees as a local versus what the liberal or Western European, scholar sees the local. So talking at the holistic approach of peace building, which the domestic actors at different societal level as well as international actors considered, important. So emphasized the practice of peace inherent among the local people and the need for the international community to recognize such people as resources, not recipients in peace building. So he sees them as resources, which has a potential which could catalyze the peace building process, and also could, with the potential and ability to make happen peace. And other scholars are drawing on the crisis in the wars in Yugoslavia and other parts of the world also, like Kurd suggested that the best peacemaking potential is found in the communities and conflicts themselves. So the local peacemakers, which are the local, resources, local leaders, local experts and practitioners, are sometimes mostly traditional leaders, are important for this localizing peace building approaches. And addressing these issues of local actors as owners and builders of peace, Ripsing and Featherston argue that local actors are the primary architects, owners, and long-term stakeholders of peace. So this new emerging scholarship of the idea of localizing peace is another one dimension of peace, which assumes that and argues for peace from below. That means the liberal intervention and the Western notion of peace still is hegemonic, still important, crucial, but at the same time, it has to have the room, the space for inclusion and incorporation of local voices, local agency, which is different perspective from the previous, post-Westphalian way of international interventionist Western, peacemaking and peace-building approach, which is usually driven by power and geopolitical interests. This one is still highly influenced by geopolitical and power interests of the Western powers, but it is trying to somehow democratize or somehow localize the liberal agenda for peace. So my argument is this notion of peace building is somehow has some good improvements, which are very much by far better than the previous old school of interventionist approaches. But this is also, fails to give much more agency and much more space for the local forces and voices to make peace. And my argument rests because I argue with the emancipatory peace approach, which is the critical, peace building approach, which recognizes the local as the scholarship, the knowledge, the capacity and the ownership to make and restore peace. So the problem with the below approach, or the turn local of the liberal peace building of the 90s, and still which is taking place by lots of civil society organizations, is it doesn't assume that the local has a knowledge. That is the crucial point of my argument, that epistemic injustice happens because the liberal notion of interventionist the turn into the local peace building approach fails to acknowledge and accommodate that the local has the wisdom and the scholarship and the knowledge to make decisions on its own affairs. And the second argument is, and my criticism rests on the assumption that peace is to be done, or to be intervened and to be resulted. That assumption of the liberal peace building approach is also still wrong, because the global south, largely specifically in Africa, peace is seen as an everyday experience, an everyday life, an everyday practice. So the idea of that we can intervene and make peace at certain places or remote areas is somehow a futile attempt, because those communities also have their own age-old practices, and making their own decisions and institutions at the same time, which are traditional somehow, but also function properly. So the idea of this theoretical consideration of epistemic injustice, which in the 1988 Spivak popularly, famously, asserted that epistemic violence comes from the educational sector because of lack of emancipatory peace, that the higher educational institutions are not free from the colonial legacy of Western or Eurocentric notion of knowledge and knowledge production and dissemination. There are some questions which I try to invoke. What criteria and measures are necessary from the theoretical perspective to address the subjects of epistemic injustice in higher education, for example, especially in the peace education, and lead to a more system of academic knowledge or reproduction, and drawing attention to epistemic dimensions enables us to understand what conditions of possibility exist for epistemic justice. It puts the attention on how we recognize people as knowers, and how people might be wronged as knowers, how knowers with power might knowingly or unknowingly perpetrate forms of injustice. So the idea of who knows what and when, and who is capable of making decisions is crucial to the epistemic justice arguments, because the idea of peace is by itself the idea of knowledge, because what constitutes peace, what constitutes, who is defining peace, is question of power and a question of epistemic, because it has a capability to to cause violence and injustice. Because if you say that your knowledge is not knowledge, because there is no African, if you say there is no African philosophy, or the global south or Asian philosophy, that means you're asserting that there is only one Eurocentric view of peace, Eurocentric view of knowledge, and it is an argument for power that sees that the international institutions, the power structures, are built on those colonial legacy of asserting that only the liberal Western centric knowledge production is hegemonic and the only truth. So that is my challenge to the peace from below approach. So conventional wisdom and formal institutions play, when we come to the African and indigenous notion of peace. So the conventional or the legal school of thought, the judicial sector play critical role in the peacemaking and peace building and the promotion of the idea of justice. But at the same time, the indigenous restorative justice conceptions are also very much essential in building peace and also maintaining and restoring relations. Indigenous international institutions have survived for centuries and have built deeply embedded networks of social capital that have maintained the social cohesion and the cultural fabric of the society. So there's so much more to research, to know, to learn about those institutions, those cultures, and those practices, and also with regards to specifically with peace. In a clear harmony with the African and indigenous principle of peace, the idea of restorative justice also profoundly builds on the same value of bringing everyone affected by the wrongdoing. This means, it aspires to see justice and peace in maintaining, the cohesion, maintaining the relationships and restoring those existing relationships. So it's not just punishing or retributive justice, but it is more of committed to the bigger, the broader social context. It is also interesting that harm is understood as committed against the common good, against the society, not one individual against another. So in this case, there is no one party offending another party. So often the ritual offends the community or the collective society. So there is a collective interest in maintaining harmony and peace. This African notion of peace is usually popularized by the Ubuntu, which means I am because we are. Emphasizes healing, the inner peace and the balance and harmony and equity. And also it has relevance with environmental justice, environmental harmony of, maintaining the closer and strong relationship with the environment. So with, with the animals, there is, the flora and fauna and the environment. So when I come to the, the liberal notion of peace, there are some critics which I already mentioned before. One is Richmond, and his post-liberal peace, argues that the liberal peace building operations, so far little has been achieved beyond the rhetoric on local ownership and participation. And the peace implemented through international peace building operations will necessarily fail because they are very desirous to some externalize the legitimacy and the norms. So international peace building is seen as inconsistent and sometimes furthering violence, disempowering the population and fostering victimhood by reproducing and reinforcing societal hierarchies, as well as internal divisions. Based on real life expressions of local agencies, such as those described above in the critics, despite the post-colonial thinking of Spivak on this subaltern, this critic sees the local as the use of countless everyday practices that transmit critical local agencies through a diversity of spheres from the very personal to the transnational level. So there's an everyday the everyday which refers to the ways people make their lives the best they can, manipulating with whatever tools and tactics are at their disposal, the surrounding natural, social, economic, and political structures, and local and global that empower or constrain their lives. So this is seen as an everyday experience, an everyday interaction with nature, with the community at large. So this critical peacemaking and peace building approach tries to bring an alternative perspective for peace, and also I have to challenge, also this notion that the two are usually in conflict with, because the liberal notion of peace from below and the emancipatory or critical peace building approach they couldn't be applied hand in hand, because the emancipatory peace approach highly supplements the deficiencies of the liberal peace building approach, which usually lacks the nuances, the understanding and the context of the local and the knowledge of the local. So, and my argument is the local has the agency, the knowledge and the power. So giving that agency or the space for self-discovery and exploration and self-determination of what is knowledge, what is peace, what is desired goal of peace, is one task of the international peace building approach, which is to be done in going on in the future when we do peace building approaches in different parts of the world. So I'll come on some of my recommendations later. This sense, rather than a geographical space, the local refers to the everyday acts of a diversity of individuals and communities that go beyond elites and the civil society normally associated with a liberal peace building. So usually the liberal schools and liberal peace building agents and actors like civil society organizations and leaders usually see the local only the civil society, local civil society organizations or local some political leaders, but the local is complex, diverse, and it is composed of a networked power and relations. So we have to be very highly sensitive and question how we intervene in those spaces. This understanding of the local emphasizes that this building is not a one-way project imposed from the top, but is continuously changing through encounters with local agencies. So this notion comes to with the decoloniality concept and the peace education and the practice of peace. The decoloniality concept, I argue that it is still happening, even though since the 1960s, African countries have been independent, and the last countries to be independent, and Zimbabwe, South Africa in the 1980s. But still, there are legacies of colonialism. There are discussions how the educational policy in South Africa still is not free from apartheid legacies. There are discussions in West Africa and in Senegal, in Cote d'Ivoire, and other places where still, the legacies and still the unhealthy relationships or unfair relationships with France are still affecting their sovereignty and their ownership of their nations. And in other parts of even Africa, even where originally I'm from Ethiopia, for example, which claims to be independent, but still, because there is so much power issues and the geopolitical issues, which fail for which the political leaders are face as a challenge to make decisions and to conduct national political and policy decision making sometimes because of the great powers, geopolitical interests and conflicts, especially with EU, China, and the US. So this decoloniality is still a continual. Sorry.
Don't interrupt, but we're about 4 minutes over already, and I always want to make sure we have time for folks.
Okay, all right, sure. So decoloniality is about challenging and dismantling and exceeding these underlying knowledge systems which sustain global inequalities and injustices. So decoloniality is not about only the colonial experience, but also the post-colonial experiences and still the power structures and reforming the UN and how with our peace operations and interventions in this global south is still reflects that colonial experience. So decolonization is a concern not simply with historical colonialism, but also addresses the coloniality of subjectivity, the labor, gender, and race. So I'll leave this discussion here. So the epistemic violence races on bringing a restoration to the communities and emancipations, ownership, and the sustainability of those peace building approaches. And there is an example in the DRC case where there was a failure.
I really do have to cut you off. We're like 6 minutes over, and we're not have time.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
If folks, if individual presenters don't mind having their chat open, I'll, as I've been doing, kind of give folks a countdown, like 5 minutes remaining, 2 minutes remaining, 1 minute remaining. It'll allow us to make sure we have room for everyone. So unfortunately, we'll pick up some of these threads, ideally Q&A, but we want to move to our second presenter at this point. The paper is entitled Russia, Ukraine, and the International Peace Community, and I'll turn it over to Stephen.
Hello, can folks hear and see me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm talking to you all from a cabin in the redwoods in far northeastern California, and but fortunately appears that the internet is working reasonably well. I just want to start by by underscoring, of course, that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a clear-cut act of aggression, a flagrant violation of the United Nations Charter and other fundamental principles of international law. And of course, it's resulted in an enormous amount of human suffering, including, of course, the multiple attacks on civilian population centers. much of the world has united against Russia. I mean, a country under Putin seems to combine some of the worst elements of the czarist and communist regimes. And also disturbing about this whole thing, a lot of people don't talk about, is that this is a direct violation of the 1994 Budapest Agreement, in which Ukraine agreed to destroy its nuclear weapons inherited from the Soviet Union in return for guarantees of its territorial integrity. So Russia's invasion has been a major setback in nuclear non-proliferation efforts. The problem is that the history of US militarism, imperialism, and false narratives have led some on the anti-war left to actually rationalize for Russian aggression and exaggerate Western responsibility. You may recall how a number of forums and rallies in the weeks preceding the invasion, calling for no war in Ukraine, focused on the non-existent threat of direct US military intervention while ignoring the very real threat and a very real and growing threat of a Russian invasion. Now, many question the Biden administration's warnings of an imminent invasion, assuming it was a lie. The Biden administration, not able to share, their sources or whatever, simply said, trust us. But remember, Biden, when he was head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, insisted that Iraq had, accumulated this vast arsenal of biological and chemical weapons, had advanced nuclear weapons programs, sophisticated delivery systems, and his chief of staff and the Foreign Relations Committee, Antony Blinken, was giving the same line. And again, they asked us to trust them. And of course, we knew that, we now know, of course, as many of us suspected at the time, those were lies. So it's kind of understandable why people might have been skeptical this time. But indeed, it was it was all too real. In addition, subsequently, some people have tried to blame Washington for Moscow's actions. And while it's certainly true that the decision by the United States to break what appears to have been a promise to the Kremlin that NATO would not expand eastward, no question that it did contribute to Putin's paranoid nationalism. Incorporating these former Warsaw Pact countries and 3 former Soviet republics into NATO could similarly be seen as unnecessarily provocative, particularly given that Russia has been invaded 4 times from Western Europe in the past couple centuries. An argument could also be made that the crisis could have been avoided if NATO had been willing to rule out membership for Ukraine, granting the nation a neutral status similar to Finland and Austria during the Cold War. But at the same time, Putin's rewriting of history and his insistence that Ukraine is inherently part of Russia, along with his decision to launch a full-scale invasion, I mean, it seems to me that, and a lot of observers actually, that he would probably invaded Ukraine regardless. I think the only real threat Ukraine has to Russia is it was becoming belatedly an increasingly well-functioning democratic European state, and with a similar culture and history with Russia, it could amount to what Chomsky has referred to as the threat of a good example. Just as the United States didn't want to have any kind of socialist alternative in the hemisphere, which could be a threat of a good example, and we sought to destroy these socialist experiments. Putin may have had a similar attitude towards this liberal democratic experiment on his border. Now, there are a lot. So I don't buy this argument, but that's America's fault that Russia invaded. That you're hearing a lot, even those who realize that the invasion was terrible and everything. That there are a lot of bad things in the world that are direct responsibility of the U.S. That really were our fault. The Islamic State would not have emerged, would not exist if U.S. hadn't invaded Iraq. it's doubtful that there would have been an Islamic revolution, the mullahs, these reactionary mullahs coming to power in Iran, if the U.S. had not overthrown the Shah in 1953. These Central American drug gangs that the right wing gets freaked out on their anti-immigration stuff probably would not exist were it not for the U.S. intervention in Central America in the 1980s. So we can go through a lot of things that bad things in the world that one really could say were ultimately the fault of the United States. But I really don't think Ukraine is one of them. I mean, this is a line that John Mearsheimer has been pushing, and a lot of anti-war people have sort of posted his comments. But Mearsheimer is actually fairly conservative politically. I mean, he has a hard time with agency. I think for example, he blames Israel for the U.S. invasion of Iraq. This is Israel's fault that the U.S. invaded, and so he has a pattern of trying to get the aggressors, off the hook, if you will. And I really don't. I mean, he makes some good points on certain things, but I think he exaggerates, frankly, the U.S. culpability. And there's some on the left who repeated the Kremlin's lies that they're neo-Nazis, controlled the Ukrainian government and military. So remember, the far right parties in the most recent elections in Ukraine received only 2.5% of the vote. I mean, that's considerably less than the far right in a number of European countries. And where they're even coming into government in places like Italy. And yeah, some members of the Azov battalion have had connections to the far right, but they're what, in the 7 years prior to the invasion, they were something like at most 2,500 soldiers. I mean, they're not a huge component of the Ukrainian military. And also this idea of genocide against the Russians. I mean, there are less than 300 civilian casualties in areas controlled by Russian-backed separatists during the past 7 years. And these include, shelling, landmines, unexploded ordnance. Not all of them from the Ukrainian side. I mean, 300 is too many. But it's not genocide, and the numbers of civilian deaths have been declining every year. And yet we keep hearing this line from many in the anti-war left. The current president, Volodymyr Zelensky, he won by a landslide. He is Jewish and an ethnic Russian, so the idea that that the Ukrainian government is controlled by Nazis committing genocide against Russian speakers is pretty absurd. He did not come to power from a coup. It was a fair and free election. He did not come from either of the traditional corrupt party blocks, one of which is more pro-Western Russian, one of which is pro-Western, but he came as an outsider. And though his promised efforts to resolve the conflict in the Donbas region and to clean up the domestic corruption were met with resistance he had yet to overcome at the time of the invasion, again, he was a popular Democratic leader. You may agree or disagree with any number of things of particular policies, but he is a legitimate leader. Now, there is the argument that while international law gives Ukraine every right to resist Russian aggression through military force, there are some serious concerns about whether the valiant but extremely costly resistance to Russian efforts to annex the country's eastern provinces is worth the cost, including the risk of nuclear war. Others argue that it's worth sacrificing tens of thousands of lives, destroying cities and livelihoods, the enormous financial and environmental costs, because we have to defend the important principle that no country has the right to expand its territory by force or unilaterally change recognized international boundaries. This is something that Biden has said repeatedly. But Western nations have hardly been consistent in upholding that principle. The United States, for example, is the only country in the world that has formally recognized Israel's illegal annexation of Syria's Golan Heights, which it seized by force in 1967. And the only country to recognize Morocco's annexation of the entire nation of Western Sahara, which is a full member state of the African Union, has been recognized by over 85 countries. Again, both these annexations are a direct violation of not just the UN Charter, but specific resolutions by the United Nations Security Council, not just the General Assembly, but the Security Council. I mean, even Reagan, supported a resolution declaring Syria's annexation of the Golan null and void and a violation of international law, whereas the Biden administration says, oh, it's part of Israel. And indeed, if you look at maps for Google Maps, Rand McNally, National Geographic, almost any maps, you'll see Western Sahara as a separate country. U.S. government maps, it's all part of Morocco, no distinction whatsoever. Similarly with Israel and the Golan. So this is not really why we are supporting Ukraine. If this was about principle, we would oppose such illegal irredentism regardless. And I think this is led to the skepticism of U.S. policy. That what is really motivating it? I mean, we may be right this time on the sense of upholding international law, but it could. Is this really why we are doing it? Is this simply an area is this largely about geopolitics? Are we really trying simply to weaken Russia, as Secretary of Defense Austin has admitted, is really part of the goal? And I should also just mention that in addition to Western Sahara and the Golan, the United States has repeatedly insisted that the Palestinians give up large swaths of the West Bank occupied by Israel as part of any peace agreement. And of course, for 25 years, we supported Indonesia's illegal occupation and annexation of East Timor. And since the 1990s, we've unofficially recognized Israel's illegal annexation of Greater East Jerusalem. So allowing Russia to hold on to Crimea, which it illegally annexed back in 2014, or parts of the Donbass region currently, and those other regions that it currently occupies illegally, would not necessarily set a dangerous new precedent. I mean, it's wrong, but it would not be this dangerous precedent people are talking about. I mean, can people in the peace movement offer alternatives to either capitulation to Russian aggression or supporting an ongoing, bitter, deadly, stalemated armed conflict? But one thing that gives us hope is that Ukraine has had an impressive history of nonviolent resistance, including the 2004-2005 Orange Revolution, following an effort by the ruling party to install the pro-Russian leader of Yanukovych into power. Let me I should mention though actually that and then of course it was the Maidan revolt, after Yanukovych was legitimately elected a few years later, that drove him out of office as he was becoming increasingly corrupt and autocratic in his style. Let me just mention, I realize I should see I'm running out of time, but that that both these uprisings are overwhelmingly nonviolent. The rioters engaged in the street fighting during the Maidan protest were the equivalent of the black bloc groups that have taken advantage of large nonviolent protests against racism and neoliberal globalization, and that they get the bulk of the media attention, but they are not leading the struggle. And the armed fascist groups that seized some government buildings in the final hours of the Maidan uprising were of little consequence, as Yanukovych had already fled to Russia by that hour. And so they are trying to, some pro-Putin elements have tried to depict it as a coup d'etat, a US-sponsored coup, which is really not true. Victoria Nuland's, the Assistant Secretary of State's efforts to influence the makeup of the post-Yanukovych interim government and an earlier trip to Ukraine, in which she expressed her solidarity with the protesters by passing out bread to the demonstrators, that is not proof of a U.S. coup. The claim that that the U.S. had $5 billion, she quoted, we said $5 billion to support democracy in Ukraine, and people saying, oh my, there's $5 billion in opposition. That $5 billion figure was actually the entire amount of U.S. foreign aid since Ukraine's independence in 1991. The support for the pro-democracy groups were a few million, largely through congressionally funded foundations and the like. And the idea that this funding opposition caused the revolution or led these revolutions or exported revolutions, I mean, that is, that's the equivalent, frankly, of during the Cold War, when we insisted that every leftist revolution of the third world was a conspiracy from Moscow because they might have sent some arms, therefore they're exporting revolutions. Soviets had a hit list, et cetera, et cetera. Both of these deny agency. You wouldn't have, hundreds of thousands of people camped out for days in the Ukrainian winter, or in the millions of other Ukrainians who supported it through strikes and boycotts and other things, just because the U.S. gave some money to some opposition groups. And I think it's really important that we, not deny agency. So just let me conclude, by noting that there have been some important ongoing nonviolent resistance in occupied areas. I think really the thing that I think can really resolve, I think the area of the peace community could really help is to support the Russian resistors, the hundreds of thousands of Russians who are resisting the draft, and to because I think really that is an area where we in fact could probably do the most good. I had a lot more to say, but I'm afraid I've gone over time, so I need to stop now.
Thank you, Stephen. We'll move on to our third paper right now, which is entitled Between Indoctrination and False Neutrality, Pedagogy Under Occupation.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and thank you for putting on this conference, especially to Michael, who's put a lot of work into the organization of the conference. So my name is Irfan Khawaja. I am currently an independent scholar in Princeton, New Jersey. I taught philosophy for about a quarter of a century until my involuntary retirement in 2020. So this is a description of some of my pedagogical practices and experiences teaching political philosophy in the occupied territories in the West Bank. So I don't know if you can see my screen.
We can.
Okay, good. So I am operating from this PowerPoint. So the talk is called Between Indoctrination and False Neutrality, Pedagogy Under Occupation. And we get this idea, a general idea in moral philosophy from Aristotle, of virtue as a mean between extremes of excess and deficiency. So Aristotle says things like courage is a mean between rashness and timidity. And I'd like to suggest that pedagogical virtue is likewise a mean between various extremes, and indoctrination and neutrality are those extremes or among the extremes, and there's a nameless virtue between them, which is what good pedagogy is. Now, the very namelessness of this virtue makes it elusive, which is why I'm going to spend some time talking about it, makes it hard to characterize and hard to hit in practice. But it's in practice that we find it, and then we retrospectively characterize it. And so that's what I'm going to be trying to do today. So this is a general truth, I think, about pedagogy, particularly in the humanities, but it is illustrated in a unique way under a military occupation. Now, in general, when you want to illustrate a general principle, you want to do so on the best case for doing so. And in philosophy, in any case, there's a kind of methodological dogma or assumption that the best case for applying a principle is the simplest one, the least fraught one, the one with the least moving parts. I happen to disagree with that. I tend to think that the best way of illustrating a general principle is to apply it to a fraught case, and a military occupation is certainly a fraught case. So I'm going to illustrate this via the political philosophy class that I taught at Al-Quds University in Abu Dis in the occupied West Bank between the years 2013 and 2017. I'll talk a little bit about the class as I get further in. So let me start by talking about indoctrination. So I have this definition here of indoctrination. I could have written a paper on indoctrination. Actually, it's a very complicated subject, but in the interest of time, I will try to foreshorten. So I take indoctrination to be the attempt to induce someone to believe a set of doctrines and act on them while systematically minimizing the attractions of the rivals to those doctrines. So pedagogical indoctrination is the attempt to do this in a classroom setting. And to understand this distinction, this definition, it seems to me that one needs to draw a distinction between learning and belief, because what I'm doing is putting a premium on belief as the target of indoctrination. So when you try to indoctrinate someone, what you're trying to do is to get them to avow in the first person what it is that you're trying to indoctrinate them in. You're trying to get them to believe it from the first person. So as I put it here, we learn about things, we believe in things. And indoctrination is a matter of getting someone to believe in something rather than getting them to learn about something. So that distinction is going to play a role in what I talk about later on. Now, pedagogical indoctrination comes in degrees, and to some degree may well be unavoidable in some contexts, depending on the subject matter. There are some contexts in which it may well be impossible to avoid some degree of indoctrination, but it comes in degrees, and at a certain level or after a certain point, it becomes objectionable. Likewise, persuasion in a classroom is not itself indoctrination, but can become indoctrinative given the power dynamics of a classroom. That is, if your persuasion starts to minimize the attractions of the rivals of the belief about which you're persuading people, then you've probably slid into indoctrination. Now, I take indoctrination to be a vice, a pedagogical vice, and one to be avoided. In its most extreme forms, it's either self-subversive or subversive the basic aims of education. So in what way? Well, when you indoctrinate someone, you're trying to get them to believe something while minimizing the merits of the alternatives to the thing that they're supposed to believe. And I take that to be incompatible with knowledgeable belief. So to believe something in a knowledgeable way is not simply to avow it, but to avow it with reasons that explain why the alternatives are to be rejected. And that's precisely what indoctrination punts on. That's what it bypasses. So as I put it on this slide, autonomous motivation and critical reflection are essential to knowledge, and that's what indoctrination subverts. It also puts the instructor in a position of domination over students. So it's as though the instructor is setting the agenda for what it is that the students are supposed to do, believe, and act on outside of the classroom. And I would say that this remains a vice even in the service of legitimate values. So if you are running a program in peace and justice studies, if it has an indoctrinative element to it, even in the service of peace and justice, what you're doing is you're minimizing the alternatives to peace and justice in a way that subverts the aim of knowledge about peace and justice, which doesn't serve the cause of peace and justice. So that's indoctrination in a nutshell. Now, it's tempting in rejecting indoctrination to go to the reverse extreme of pedagogical neutrality. So if indoctrination attempts to induce belief or action or both, neutrality is the principled refusal to induce belief or action or both. But that's a little bit too broad a characterization to be all that useful, and is in the nature of something negative like neutrality. Neutrality is a refusal is a negative phenomenon. It's in the nature of negative characterizations to be a little bit broad and vague. So let me specify the context. The context that I have in mind is a core curriculum class in the humanities. And neutrality in this context expresses itself as the belief that what we need to do is teach each text for itself or on its own terms so as to avoid indoctrination. So there are two features of this that I take to be essential to pedagogical neutrality, at least in this context. One is the refusal to apply the text to the contemporary world. So if you're teaching, let's say, Plato, what you're doing is teaching Plato's Republic in the context in which Plato's Republic was written, that is, in ancient Athens. You're not trying to extend that to the contemporary context. And the second feature of pedagogical neutrality is the refusal to avow one's own beliefs in class. So I take it that when you're indoctrinating, that's just about all you're doing. You're avowing your beliefs and trying to induce others' beliefs in them. Neutrality would be the attempt to refuse to advocate for any beliefs whatsoever. So in that respect, it's at the polar extreme from indoctrination. Now, I take neutrality to be the equal and opposite vice in a pedagogical context. So again, specifying the same context of the core curriculum in the humanities, two of the challenges of humanities education are accessibility and relevance, and neutrality makes those difficult or impossible. So if you are not applying the text to the contemporary context, and you're not avowing your own beliefs in class, what you've done is you've made the text distant from your target audience in a way that makes them inaccessible and irrelevant, and so loses the audience. I would also say that strict neutrality is impossible anyway, because the structure of a class reflects non-neutral choices. And so the attempt to be absolutely neutral is quixotic and self-subverting in a different way than indoctrination, but just as fully. And unstrict neutrality would be pointless. So what one ought to do, or what I've tried to do, is find the mean between pedagogical indoctrination and neutrality. Now, this is a matter of practice, and I liken it to learning how to ride a bike or swimming or driving, which is to say, you really can't go right until you go wrong. That is, you've got to crash into the extremes until you find the mean, hopefully without crashing or drowning. I should say you collide rather than crash into the extremes. And this is where the issue of pedagogy under occupation is joined. So the ideal impetus for learning the mean, finding the mean, is a case in which it becomes imperative to get things right in a way in which it's not in an ordinary classroom. You can go to the extremes and not cause all that much damage. But under occupation, the damage of the extremes is itself extreme. If you indoctrinate students under occupation, you are causing a serious problem. And likewise, if you engage in neutrality under occupation, you've caused a different kind of problem. Likewise, the temptations of going to the extremes are also intense under occupation. So let me get to occupation. So I don't have time here to characterize the nature of the military occupation in the West Bank. I'll just refer you to any source on it. But it's uncontroversial to say that the victims under military occupation are systematically deprived of liberty, dignity, security, and material goods. So suppose that you, an American, are invited to teach Western political philosophy in this context. You will, despite any resolutions to the contrary, have very strong incentives to indoctrinate. And I think they come from two opposite perspectives. One I think of as mission civilisatrice, the civilizing mission, and the other is revolution. That is, you can be put off, for instance, by your students' militancy and want to ratchet it back, or you can be put off by your students' relative apathy and want to ratchet up their militancy. Conversely, you might want to ignore the occupation altogether and simply think that engagement with the occupation is an unnecessary complication, an unnecessary provocation. You're just here to teach the material, and you should let the occupation sort itself out. But I think these temptations should be avoided. So indoctrination of either variety, ratchet back their militancy or ratchet up their militancy, undercuts their capacity for autonomous judgment. It in effect gives them your agenda rather than letting them set their own agenda. It involves a kind of presumption that you know what's best for them in a context that you are only visiting and that they are living in. And it seems to me a recipe for betrayal, precisely because you're leaving and they're not. If you enroll them in a project, the project in which you're enrolling them is a project which you are departing and they are in. So you're not bearing the consequences of the task that you've begun. In its extreme versions, indoctrination leads either to collaboration or incitement. That is, if you ratchet back their militancy, what you're trying to do is to induce them to collaborate with the occupation. And if you ratchet it up, what you're trying to do is to induce them to attack the occupation. In either case, it's not that I'm arguing against either of these right now. My point is you're not bearing the consequences of what you're starting. But neutrality disengages from the realities that they confront and leaves them ill-equipped to deal with it. And in that case, leads them to boredom and resentment. So here is the course that I taught. I taught a standard survey course in Western political philosophy in multiple translation. So the texts were themselves translated from whatever the original was, ancient Greek, Italian, whatever. I was reading them in English. The students were reading them in Arabic. I was teaching in English. I had a translator who was translating my English into Arabic and translating their Arabic back to me. Now, I know enough Arabic for this to work, and they knew enough English for it to work, but I don't know enough Arabic to teach a class in Arabic, and they didn't know enough English to have a class in English. So that's the explanation for the arrangement. So the translator became a kind of co-teacher, and we became comrades and friends on the side. And I became a kind of co-student. It was essential to teaching under occupation that I was not in this hierarchical position of being someone who knew more than they did, because the occupation was the secondary theme of the class. So what I was doing was taking these texts and in effect appending the occupation as the subject matter of the class. So it was really political philosophy and the occupation. So this is what I did with each of these texts. I won't drag you through all of these in the interest of time, but you can see that what I did in each of these 6 cases is I took a central question that was essential to the text, and I rephrased it so that it was directly relevant to the occupation. So I'll just take 2 of these. In the case of Locke is famous for his defense of liberalism, and the question that we discussed was, is Lockean liberalism the root of the occupation or the way out of it? In the case of Mill, we read on liberty, and so the question that I asked was particularized to their context. What are the taboos of Palestinian thought and discourse? Should these taboos be broken? And what we happened to discuss was homosexuality as a taboo in Palestinian thought and discourse, whether it should be discussed, and how it should be dealt with. And the final exam question was plan an intifada, plan an uprising, and describe the role, if any, of philosophy within that uprising. Now, did I find the mean? Well, I think I avoided the extremes. The class was not indoctrinative because it was structured as a nested series of questions rather than an inducement to any particular set of beliefs. It wasn't neutral because I explicitly engaged the occupation, and I did on occasion avow my own beliefs in class without making them the subject of the class. It's hard to say whether I actually found the mean. I found the class successful on my own terms. It solicited critical engagement. It generated some illuminating discussion, created lifelong friendships. It taught me a great deal. I think it's not for me to say whether it found the mean, but I certainly gave it a try. So to bring it home, teaching under occupation was a life-changing experience that I really cannot capture in a 15-minute or even 30-minute conversation. So you'll just have to take my word for it. It revolutionized the way I taught when I returned to the United States, and it revolutionized how I saw the United States when I came back. It sharpened my grasp of this mean, my worry about the extremes, and it intensified my will to stay on track in circumstances that are less fraught than occupation. That is, to try harder to find this mean when I came to more sedate circumstances like the ones that I taught in New Jersey. It stimulated an appetite for finding the mean in fraught circumstances. And so I started to seek out such circumstances in activist contexts and other contexts, Antifa, et cetera, to try to do something similar to what I was able to do in the West Bank. And it also taught me that there are more occupations than meet the eye, but no power more powerful and more subversive of them than eyes to see and the will to resist. And so that is the sum of what I got out of teaching pedagogy under occupation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And our final paper is entitled How Some Oral Traditions Teach for Peace. Irfan, you have to stop sharing your screen, I think. There we go. Perfect.
My name is Fatima. Yes. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I was just gonna say that, but please proceed, Fatima.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Fatima Ahmed. I am currently a law student at the University of Saskatchewan, but the paper I'm presenting is the literature review chapter from the thesis that's still in progress that I was completing towards an Ahmed degree, Education for Change Ahmed degree with a dual specialization in Indigenous education as well as social justice education. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the introduction section of my chapter review, then I'm going to read one of the 4 sections, and then I'm going to read the conclusion just in the interest of time. And I'm happy to share the more detailed literature review if there is enough interest. I'm going to start now. In the introduction chapter of this thesis, I spoke to my current understanding of education and its role in personal development. After establishing basic definitions and motivations in the introduction section, I presented the thesis of this research project, which is as follows. We acknowledge cognitive imperialism exists against and within Indigenous populations. It is this cognitive imperialism that discounts revealed knowledges as a legitimate source of knowledge. I argue that both Islamic and Inuit knowledges are based on revealed knowledges, and that within these knowledges are principles of peacekeeping and peacemaking. The first principle of peacemaking within both these traditions is self-temperance, or starting peace with oneself. Considering the focus of this research, I will now conduct a literature review and highlight some commonalities between Muslim culture and various Indigenous beliefs and knowledges. These similarities are categorized into 4 categories. A, the impact of and the importance of resisting cognitive imperialism. B, belief in revealed knowledges. C, the importance of leveraging Indigenous cultures and traditions for peacekeeping and peacemaking. And D, the importance of self-temperance as a step towards advancing peace with our surroundings. These similarities are important to acknowledge as they suggest that by examining Inuit oral tradition and comparing them to oral Islamic traditions and how they teach for peace, we can develop principles for teaching peace in various Canadian school settings. My study assumes commonalities between Islamic and Indigenous peacebuilding traditions, which can help us reach and practice a more nuanced understanding of individual and collective peace within the Canadian education system. So A, I'm going to read actually 2 sections of the literature review. So the first one is A, the impact of and importance of resisting cognitive imperialism. This category of literature review makes the argument that cognitive imperialism exists within the academy, and this cognitive imperialism amounts to violence. To fight this cognitive imperialism, it is imperative to recognize the legitimacy of non-Western epistemologies, as failing to do so will trigger a deep challenge to the core constructs of non-Western peoples and knowledges. Cormier, 2016, describes cognitive imperialism in the following words. Cognitive imperialism is an extreme form of violence that infiltrates the structures of society. It is particularly insidious as it becomes unseen to the majority of the population, forming the foundation upon which a culture of violence can blossom and spread. Galton, when writing about cultural violence, suggested that direct violence is an event. Structural violence is a process with ups and downs. Cultural violence is an invariant, a permanence. I propose that cognitive imperialism can be categorized in all 3, direct, structural, and cultural violence. So Harvard Divinity School summarizes these 3 forms of violence, and I'm not going to go through those definitions. Thus, the urgency and importance of are clear. Archibald writes that Western education educational institutions replaced oral traditions with limited definitions of literacy. Echoes this point that within public education, the most serious problem lies not in its failure to liberate the human potential among Aboriginal peoples. This quote speaks to the importance of recognizing the legitimacy of non-Eurocentric knowledge systems, which is one of the intended goals of this thesis. In suggesting a solution to the current situation, Walker writes that in order to decolonize conflict resolution, we need to respect and understand Indigenous worldviews and acknowledge that Indigenous approach is important because I believe that our
Fatima, I think we may have just lost you. Let me double check, but I think you just got kicked out. Yeah. So I'll wait for Fatima, I imagine, to rejoin us. We'll just be patient for a second, and my guess is that she got kicked off. There we go. Fatima, you back with us? Are you back, Fatima?
Yes, I am back. Yes, sorry, I got kicked out. I apologize. Because of this, I am motivated to engage in the research that disproves this unfair portrayal of traditional epistemologies. Cormier asserts that cognitive imperialism is a form of cognitive manipulation used to disclaim other knowledge bases and values that denies people their language and cultural integrity by maintaining the legitimacy of only one language, one culture, and one frame of reference. Continuing, the author concludes that cultural imperialism finds intellectual justification for this form of violence. What this means for me is that I do not have to play victim any longer to cognitive imperialism and cognitive colonialism, and that I can fight the violence where a form of knowledge is considered invalid because it is not recognized within the logic and reason-based Western discourse. Section 2. Part B, Belief in Revealed Knowledges. In this section of the literature review, I will share with the reader the theory about the existence of three grand revelations, how certain traditions believe that law is derived from these revelations through spiritual exercise. One example of this spiritual exercise is the use of spoken word as prayer, and consequently, we speak about the power of prayer over the natural world. Lastly, I make a connection between how this view on revealed knowledges lends credibility to the oral tradition as a valid way of arriving upon knowledge. Sayyid Hussein Nasir writes about divine law that since Christianity did not propose religious law, unlike Judaism and Islam, religious law in the West developed in a very different manner than it did in Islam. For example, he writes that divine law is communicated to us through revealed knowledges, and the author defines revealed knowledges as teaching that reach humanity through revelation, which means the direct conveying of a message from heaven. He goes on to clarify that there are three grand revelations and elaborates that these are and I quote, the cosmos, the human state, and the religions. There is, first of all, the cosmic book to be read and deciphered. Then there's the inner book of the soul, which we carry within ourselves. And finally, there are sacred scriptures, which are keys for reading the other two books, that of the cosmos and that of the soul. This last quote is how I define revealed knowledges moving forward. Knowledges that are known intuitively through a revelation from the creator to the soul of the human and the non-human creation. This intuitive knowledge can be harvested through the practice of tafakkur, where this word is defined as an act of thinking, contemplating, reflecting, training. An instance from the Quran where the sacred scriptures call to reflection of the cosmos around us is found in the 78th chapter titled The Great News. And I will recite that chapter. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. ألم نجعل الأرض مهادا والجبال أوتادا وخلقناكم أزواجا وجعلنا نومكم سباتا وجعلنا الليل لباسا وجعلنا النهار معاشا وبنينا فوقكم سبعا شدادا وجعلنا سراجا وهاجا وأنزلنا من المؤسرات ماء ثجاجا لنخرج به حبا ونباتا وجنات ألفافا. And the translation of the Arabic stated above is as follows. Have we not made the earth a resting place, and the mountains as stakes? And we created you in pairs, and made your sleep a means for rest, and made the night as clothing, and made the day for livelihood. And constructed above you 7 strong heavens, and made therein a burning lamp, and sent down from the rain clouds pouring water, that he may bring forth thereby grain and vegetation, and gardens of entwined growth. Thus, I suggest that it is important to study commonalities between Islamic and indigenous peace-building traditions because Islamic traditions have access to the book of sacred scripture, while the various indigenous traditions have immense and established access to the revelation related to the cosmos and the human state. Thus, all three forms of revelation complement each other and can help us reach and practice a more nuanced understanding of peace. Considering the variety of ways in which law can be derived, Eris and Cutfeet suggest that the community's traditional laws and duties to the land arise from their accumulated knowledge of the land, which is within our hearts and our minds. Similarly, in Islamic tradition, there is the belief that the lawgiver is the creator, and these laws are inherently known to our spirits due to the ahad of alast, which is the oath taken at alast, which took place prior to our spirit's existence within this realm and the world. Thus, recognizing that knowledge exists within our hearts and minds is central to the idea that there are certain laws which, while not recognized within the nation-state law, have an instrumental and seminal bearing and influence on the adherents of the certain tradition. This very belief was echoed by Pinto when the author wrote, "Importance is given to spiritual aspects of Navajo thought because there is essentially no division between the aspects of Navajo spirituality and Navajo common law." The recognition of revealed knowledges also leads us to the power of spoken word, especially as prayer. In elucidating this concept, Archibald quotes an elder, Lee Miracle, and he says, "We regard words as coming from original being, a sacred spiritual being. The orator is coming from a place of prayer. Words are not objects to be wasted. They represent the accumulated knowledge, cultural values, and the vision of an entire people or peoples. We believe the proof of a thing or idea is in the doing. Doing requires some form of social interaction, and thus story is the most persuasive and sensible way to present the accumulated thoughts and values of a people." In speaking about the Mabasantar, the authors mention the use of divination to establish guilt. This aspect of using divination for the purpose of educating conflict cases has some commonality with the Islamic prayer of istikhara. The idea that guilty people who took this false oath were left to deal with their consciences, which judged them accordingly, is exactly an idea that also exists in Islamic theology. Within the book titled Creating the Third Force, Indigenous Processes of Peacemaking, edited by Tuso and Flaherty, Osambo writes about the power of the curse and suggests that curses were used as a last resort due to their far-reaching impact. Within Islamic traditions of peacekeeping, this use of a curse if someone takes a false oath or lies as a witness also exists. In fact, an imam will often use it as a last resort to bring temporary negative peace when a positive peaceful resolution cannot be reached. Thus, the statement that a curse has the might of law and as a result it was commonly used to regulate human relations is essential to understanding how oral traditions regulate relations and build peace. Miller and Davidson Hunt quote Halliwell stating, according to Pagangicum elders, the land they inhabit is occupied by numerous beings who possess agency similar to humans, with the ability to think, make decisions, and pursue their own life projects. This belief in the metaphysical nature of seen and unseen beings around us is seminal to the teachings of Islamic Sufi tradition. In fact, we have prayers especially invoked in response to fire, winds, and other natural phenomena. For example, when there is a heavy wind, Muslims are taught through hadith or the sayings of the Prophet to say the following supplication. The wind is from the mercy of Allah. It brings mercy and brings punishment. When you see it, do not curse it. Ask Allah or God for its good and seek refuge in Allah or God for its evil. Thus, these pieces of literature not only teach about the power of spoken words as prayer, but also the influence of these spoken words on the natural world elements such as fire and wind. When we agree to approach spoken word as possibly divinely inspired, we can make an argument for the authenticity and legitimacy of oral tradition. All Islamic traditional knowledge is premised on the authenticity of the oral tradition, which is how we have received the revealed knowledges known as the Quran as well as the prophetic narrations known as hadiths. Echoing this point, Kovac writes, an indigenous worldview that honors orality as a means of transmitting knowledge and upholds the relational, which is necessary to maintain a collectivist tradition. Similarly, Lavalley states traditional teachings encompass knowledge that has been passed down through generations. Knowledge acquired through revelation, such as dreams, visions, and intuition, is sometimes regarded as spiritual knowledge, which is understood as coming from the spirit world and ancestors. In summary, we can honor revealed knowledges, lending legitimacy to Islamic and indigenous oral traditions discussed further below. So that was section 2 of the literature review. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through section 3 and section 4, and I'm just going to read the conclusion. So it should take 1 more minute. Chapter conclusion. In his seminal work, Nonviolence and Peacebuilding in Islam, Abu Nimer quotes Sayyid Sikandar Mehdani. Islam in the Muslim world still remains, to a considerable extent, rather neglected areas of peace studies and peace research. Being very largely a colonized world engaged for years, the Muslim world remains busy for quite some time, waging peace and striving to create a decolonized, just, and peaceful society rather than producing sufficient peace literature, explaining Islam's position on the issues concerned. Abu Nimer goes on to suggest that shifting emphasis from war to peace in the study of Islamic religion and culture can contribute to furthering the understanding among Western and Easterners, Muslims and non-Muslims, believers and non-believers. Abu Nimer detailed 6 guiding principles in this work that aims to shift emphasis from war to peace. The second part of his call is to contribute to furthering the understanding between various groups. It is this desire to promote understanding between Islamic and indigenous traditions that propels me to conduct research on similarities between Islamic and Inuit peace-building approaches and schemas. As can be seen above, 4 categories of similarities were observed between oral indigenous traditions and oral Islamic knowledge, specifically those beliefs that are identified as taught by Sufi teachers. These similarities are categorized into 4 categories. A, the impact of and the importance of resisting cognitive imperialism. B, a belief in revealed knowledges. C, the importance of leveraging indigenous cultures and traditions for peacekeeping and peacemaking is acknowledged across these knowledge systems. And D, the importance of self-temperance as a step towards advancing peace within our surroundings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fatima. Right now we have about 10 minutes for questions. We can take questions from folks here. They'll have to speak up so they can be picked up by the microphone. But folks are also able to ask questions of each other, since that seems there are some through lines, certainly. So I'll open it up for questions. Oh, and actually, as been our practice, we will stop the recording because we don't record the Q&A.